Two nations, one faith, a rivalry that has torn an entire region apart for decades. On one side, Saudi Arabia, a kingdom built on oil, ruled by a royal family that claims guardianship over the holiest cities in all of Islam. On the other, Iran, an ancient civilization that transformed overnight into an Islamic republic, driven by a revolutionary ideology that challenged every throne in the Muslim world, including the one in Riyadh. For centuries, the Persian and the Arab worlds traded, fought, and coexisted across the waters of the Gulf. But something changed in 1979. A revolution in Tehran lit a fire that has never been extinguished. It didn't just overthrow a Shah. It declared war on the existing order of the Middle East. It told the kings and the emirs and the princes of the Arab world that their time was over, that a new kind of Islamic government was coming. And it looked directly at Riyadh when it said it. Since that moment, Saudi Arabia and Iran have competed for influence, for oil markets, for the loyalty of Muslim populations from Beirut to Karachi. They have backed opposite sides in wars in Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon. They have armed different factions, funded different militias, and spread different visions of what Islam should look like in the modern world. But this is not simply a religious war between Sunni and Shia, as headlines so often suggest. Religion is real, but beneath it lie older, deeper forces: national identity, imperial ambition, oil wealth, and the raw hunger for regional dominance. To understand why these two giants cannot make peace, you have to go back further than 1979. You have to go back to empires, to prophecies, to the very birth of Islam itself. Because the roots of this rivalry run through 14 centuries of history, and unless you understand them, nothing that happens in the Middle East today will ever fully make sense. This is the story of why Saudi Arabia and Iran are rivals. Long before there was a Saudi Arabia, long before the Islamic Republic of Iran, the lands on either side of the Persian Gulf had already developed distinct and powerful identities that would shape everything that came after. To understand the modern rivalry between Riyadh and Tehran, one must first descend into the deep past, into the Persian empires, the Arab tribes of the Arabian Peninsula, and the founding rupture within Islam that would echo across 14 centuries. The Persian Empire, at its height under the Achaemenid dynasty in the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, was one of the greatest civilizations the world had ever seen. Stretching from the borders of India to the shores of the Aegean Sea, it governed diverse peoples through sophisticated bureaucracy, built the legendary Royal Road, and produced art, philosophy, and governance that influenced civilizations for millennia. The Persians were not Arabs. They spoke a different language, worshipped different gods before the coming of Islam, and saw themselves as heirs to a long and glorious imperial tradition. This sense of civilizational distinctiveness never disappeared. Even after the Arab Muslim armies swept out of the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century CE and conquered the Persian heartland, the Persians did not simply dissolve into Arab identity. They converted to Islam, yes, but they carried their language, their culture, and their pride with them into the new faith, and they bent the civilization of Islam in their direction as much as they were bent by it. On the Arabian Peninsula, a very different world had taken shape. The Arabs of the Hijaz, the western strip of land that hugged the Red Sea and contained the cities of Mecca and Medina, were a collection of tribes, merchants, and nomads. They lacked the bureaucratic empires of the Persians or the Romans, but they possessed something no empire could manufacture: the holy cities. Mecca, with the Kaaba at its center, was already a sacred site long before the birth of the Prophet Muhammad around 570 CE. When Muhammad received his revelations and began to preach the message of Islam, it was from this Arabian soil that the new faith radiated outward. The Arabic language became the language of God's word. The Arabian Peninsula became the spiritual center of the world's newest and fastest growing religion. This geographic and spiritual reality would matter enormously in subsequent centuries. The Arabs had produced the Prophet, the Quran, and the original community of Muslims. The Persians had ancient civilization, philosophy, and an administrative genius that the early Arab Empire desperately needed. As the Islamic Caliphate expanded and consolidated in the decades after Muhammad's death in 632 CE, these two worlds collided and merged, but never completely. The tension between Arab origin and Persian sophistication was always simmering beneath the surface of the unified Islamic world. And then came the event that would define everything. The death of the Prophet Muhammad left the young Muslim community with a devastating question: who would lead? Muhammad had no surviving sons. He had companions, relatives, and followers of different degrees of closeness and credibility. Two primary camps emerged. One group held that leadership should pass to the most capable and respected among the companions, chosen by consensus. This group would become the Sunni majority. The other group believed that leadership belonged by right to Ali ibn Abi Talib, Muhammad's cousin and son-in-law, the husband of his daughter Fatima, and the father of his grandchildren Hassan and Hussein. This group would become the Shia, a word derived from Shi'at Ali, meaning the partisans of Ali. Ali was eventually recognized as the fourth caliph, but his reign was troubled and contested. He was assassinated in 661 CE. His son Hassan renounced the caliphate under pressure. And then came the moment that would burn itself into the Shia consciousness forever: the Battle of Karbala in 680 CE. Ali's younger son Hussein, grandson of the Prophet himself, refused to pledge allegiance to the Umayyad Caliph Yazid, whom he regarded as corrupt and illegitimate. He traveled with a small band of followers and family members toward Kufa in modern-day Iraq, where he had been promised support. The support never came. Instead, a vastly superior Umayyad force met Hussein and his companions on the plains of Karbala. On the 10th day of the Islamic month of Muharram, a day the Shia would call Ashura, Hussein and most of the men with him were killed. The women and children of his family were taken prisoner. The massacre at Karbala was not simply a military defeat. For the Shia, it became the defining spiritual catastrophe of their faith, a story of righteous suffering, of justice crushed by power, of a legitimate leader martyred by a corrupt establishment. The annual commemoration of Ashura, in which Shia Muslims around the world mourn Hussein's death with processions and lamentation, remains one of the most powerful religious observances in the world. And its emotional and political implications are profound. The Shia tradition carries within it a deep suspicion of established authority, a reverence for the suffering of the righteous, and a conviction that the true line of leadership was stolen from them at the very birth of Islam. The significance of these events for the modern Iran-Saudi rivalry cannot be overstated. The majority of Iranians are Shia Muslims, not because of some ancient Persian tradition, but because of a remarkable historical transformation in the early 16th century, when the Safavid dynasty came to power in Iran and made Twelver Shia Islam the state religion. For the Safavids, making Iran officially Shia was partly a religious conviction and partly a political calculation. It distinguished the Iranian state from the Sunni Ottoman Empire to the west, creating a civilizational frontier that corresponded to both theological difference and geopolitical rivalry. By contrast, the Arabian Peninsula became the heartland of Sunni Islam, and particularly of the Hanbali legal tradition, the most conservative and textualist of the four main Sunni schools of law. And when the 18th century brought a new and fierce religious reform movement in Arabia, The stage was set for a confrontation that would eventually give birth to modern Saudi Arabia and reshape the entire Sunni world. In the 1740s, in the arid interior of the Arabian Peninsula known as the Najd, a religious scholar named Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab began to preach a message of radical purification. He condemned what he saw as innovations, superstitions, and corruptions that had crept into Muslim practice over the centuries, including the veneration of saints' tombs, which the Shia practiced with particular devotion. Ibn Abd al-Wahhab's theology was uncompromising. Islam should be stripped back to what he believed was the practice of the earliest Muslim community, and anything that deviated from that standard was bid'ah, forbidden innovation. Ibn Abd al-Wahhab formed an alliance with Muhammad ibn Sa'd, a local chieftain who provided military muscle while the cleric provided religious legitimacy. This partnership, sealed in 1744 in the town of Diriyah, was the founding compact of what would eventually become the Saudi state. The Al-Saud dynasty and the Wahhabi religious establishment have remained bound together ever since in a relationship of mutual dependence that defines Saudi Arabia to this day. The king rules the state. The religious establishment legitimizes the ruler. Together they define Saudi Arabia as the guardian of Sunni Islamic orthodoxy. The religious establishment spawned by this alliance regarded Shia Islam not merely as a different interpretation of the faith, but as a dangerous deviation, sometimes even as a form of polytheism, because of Shia veneration of the imams and their intercession. The theological contempt that Wahhabi scholars expressed for Shia practice was deep and systematic. And because Iran was not only the world's largest Shia country, but also the seat of Shia scholarly and spiritual authority, the Saudi Wahhabi religious framework was, from its origins, in implicit tension with the Persian Shia world. These were the deep roots, the ancient Persian civilization's pride, the Arab Islamic heartland's religious authority. The Sunni Shia split at Karbala, the Safavid transformation of Iran into a Shia state, and the Wahhabi-Saudi compact in Arabia. None of this, on its own, made war inevitable. For most of the 20th century, Saudi Arabia and Iran coexisted and even cooperated, bound together by shared dependence on oil revenues and a common Cold War patron in the United States. But the roots were there, waiting for the right political earthquake to crack the surface. That earthquake came in 1979. For much of the 20th century, Saudi Arabia and Iran found themselves on the same side of history's great divides. Both were monarchies. Both were rich in oil. Both were deeply suspicious of Soviet communism and aligned, to varying degrees, with the United States. Their relationship was competitive in certain ways. Both competed for influence in the Gulf, and both wanted to shape OPEC policy to their advantage. But it was not the existential confrontation that would come later. The transformation from wary partnership to outright rivalry required a trigger of extraordinary magnitude. That trigger was the Iranian Revolution of 1979. To understand the revolution's impact, one must first understand what Iran looked like before it. Under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who had ruled since 1941 and who was reinstated with American and British help after the CIA-backed coup that overthrew Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, Iran was a rapidly modernizing autocracy. The Shah invested oil revenues in industrialization, expanded education, and pursued a foreign policy that made Iran the dominant military power in the Gulf. His White Revolution of 1963 introduced land reform, women's suffrage, and literacy programs, measures that pleased Washington but horrified the traditional religious establishment. Beneath the surface of modernity, however, massive inequalities persisted, political repression was severe, and the Shah's secret police, SAVAK, was feared and hated. In the late 1970s, these tensions exploded. A broad coalition of opposition forces, religious clerics, leftists, liberals, bazaar merchants, students, and workers, united around the charismatic figure of Grand Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who had been exiled first to Iraq and then to France. Khomeini's message was revolutionary in the most literal sense. He did not merely want to reform Iran's government. He wanted to replace the entire existing order with an Islamic republic governed by the principle of Vilayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. In Khomeini's framework, sovereignty belonged not to the people or to a king, but to God, interpreted and administered by the senior religious authority. It was a theological political vision unlike anything the Islamic world had seen implemented at a national scale. The revolution succeeded with stunning speed. By January 1979, the Shah had fled Iran. By February, Khomeini had returned from exile in triumph. By April, Iran had voted overwhelmingly in a referendum to establish the Islamic Republic. Within months, a system of governance was being built that was simultaneously deeply Islamic and radically anti-monarchical, anti-imperialist, and anti-American. The seizure of the American embassy in Tehran in November 1979 and the 444-day hostage crisis that followed announced to the world that the Islamic Republic intended to chart a genuinely independent and confrontational course. For Saudi Arabia, the Iranian Revolution was a shock of the first order. The Saudis had watched with a mixture of concern and disdain as popular unrest grew in Iran, but few had imagined that it would result in the complete collapse of the Shah's regime. The fall of the Shah was alarming not just geopolitically, but existentially. Here was a powerful monarchy, armed to the teeth with American weapons and sitting on vast oil wealth, and it had been swept away by a religious populist movement in a matter of months. The Saudis could not help but ask, could it happen to us? Khomeini made sure they stayed afraid. He had no use for the Saudi monarchy. He regarded the al-Saud family as corrupt, illegitimate rulers who had reduced the holy cities of Mecca and Medina to stages for royal prestige while bowing before American imperialism. He openly called for the export of the Islamic Revolution, not just to the Shia populations of the Gulf, but to Sunni Muslims everywhere. His message was that the revolution was not Shia or Persian, but universally Islamic. Kings and emirs everywhere should tremble, because the people's Islamic awakening could reach them too. The Saudis responded by positioning themselves as the alternative Islamic model, the stable, orthodox, Sunni version of Islamic governance, in contrast to Iran's chaotic revolutionary Shiism. Saudi oil money flowed into madrasas, mosques, and Islamic institutions around the world, spreading the Wahhabi interpretation of Sunni Islam as a counterweight to Iranian revolutionary influence. This religious competition played out across Muslim-majority countries from Indonesia to Nigeria to Bosnia, would become one of the defining features of the next 4 decades. 1979 also brought another crisis that shook the Saudi establishment to its foundations. On November 20th, just 2 weeks after the American hostages were seized in Tehran, a group of Sunni militants seized the Grand Mosque in Mecca, the holiest site in Islam. The leader of the group, Jahaman al-Otaibai, was a disaffected veteran of the Saudi National Guard who believed that the Saudi royal family had become too westernized and corrupt. He and his followers announced that the Mahdi, the messianic figure of Islamic eschatology, had come in the person of one of their companions, and they called for the overthrow of the al-Saud. The siege of the Grand Mosque lasted 2 weeks and resulted in hundreds of deaths. It was eventually ended with the help of French special forces. But the episode terrified the Saudi government. To demonstrate their Islamic credentials after the embarrassment, the royal family gave the religious establishment even more power over social life. Television entertainment was censored, cinemas were closed, and the moral police were given expanded authority. Saudi Arabia turned itself more firmly inward toward a conservative religious identity. And then came the Iran-Iraq War, which began in September 1980 when Saddam Hussein's Iraq invaded Iran. The war, which would last 8 devastating years and kill hundreds of thousands of people, immediately became a proxy theater of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry. Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states backed Iraq with money, political support, and intelligence. They feared that a victorious revolutionary Iran, flush with the energy of the Islamic Revolution, would become an unstoppable regional hegemon and an inspiration to Shia populations inside their own countries, including Saudi Arabia's own rest of Eastern province, where much of the kingdom's oil was located and where Shia Muslims formed a significant portion of the population. Iran, for its part, refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Gulf monarchies and continued broadcasting its revolutionary message. In 1987, the rivalry reached one of its bloodiest early flashpoints. During the annual Hajj pilgrimage in Mecca, Iranian pilgrims organized a political demonstration, a practice Khomeini had championed as a way of using the world's largest Islamic gathering as a platform for revolutionary propaganda. Saudi security forces confronted the demonstrators. In the chaos that followed, 402 people died, including 275 Iranian pilgrims. Iran erupted with fury. Mobs attacked the Saudi embassy in Tehran. Khomeini called for the overthrow of the Saudi ruling family. Saudi Arabia responded by severing diplomatic relations with Iran, a rupture that would take years to heal. By the time Khomeini died in June 1989 and the Iran-Iraq War had ended in an exhausted stalemate, the basic architecture of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry was firmly in place. Iran was a revolutionary Shia state committed to exporting its model and challenging the existing order. Saudi Arabia was a monarchical Sunni state committed to preserving that order and containing Iranian influence. Both were regional powers with significant military capabilities, vast oil wealth, and transnational religious networks. And between them lay a Middle East crisscrossed with sectarian communities, weak states, and potential proxy battlegrounds. The Cold War between the superpowers was ending. The regional Cold War between Riyadh and Tehran was just beginning. The 1990s and 2000s were decades of apparent relative calm between Saudi Arabia and Iran, but beneath the surface, the rivalry was deepening and spreading. A network of proxy conflicts and influence operations was being built across the Middle East, and each new crisis added another layer of complexity and bitterness to the confrontation. When the Arab Spring arrived in 2010 and 2011 and shook the foundations of state after state across the region, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry exploded into full view, giving shape and direction to conflicts that killed hundreds of thousands and displaced millions. The key to understanding this phase is the concept of the Shia crescent, a term attributed to Jordan's King Abdullah II, who warned in 2004 of an arc of Shia influence stretching from Iran through Iraq to Syria and onto Lebanon, all potentially under Tehran's influence. Whether or not this was an accurate description of a pre-existing reality or a self-fulfilling prophecy energized by Sunni fear, it became the organizing framework through which Saudi Arabia viewed the Middle East. Iraq was the crucible in which this new phase of rivalry was first tested. The American invasion of 2003, which toppled Saddam Hussein, produced consequences that neither Washington nor Riyadh had fully anticipated. Saddam's secular Ba'athist regime had been a brutal, Sunni-dominated dictatorship that had kept Iraq's Shia majority, roughly 60% of the population, under its boot for decades. With Saddam gone and the Iraqi state dismantled, the Shia majority moved to the center of Iraqi political life. Iran, which had cultivated relationships with Iraqi Shia political and militant movements since the Iran-Iraq War, suddenly found itself with enormous influence in a neighboring country that had previously been its most formidable enemy. For Saudi Arabia, this was a nightmare scenario. Iraq, which had served as a Sunni Arab buffer against Iran, had been handed by American military action directly into Tehran's sphere of influence. The subsequent Iraqi civil war, which intensified dramatically in 2006 and 2007 after the bombing of the Golden Dome Shia shrine at Samarra, was not merely an insurgency against American occupation. It was also a sectarian bloodbath in which Sunni and Shia militias massacred each other's communities in Baghdad and across central Iraq. Saudi Arabia and Iran poured fuel on these flames from opposite sides. Saudi money flowed to Sunni insurgent networks, while Iran funded and trained Shia militias. The two countries were fighting each other through Iraqi proxies, and Iraqi civilians paid the price in blood. Lebanon was another theater. Iran's relationship with Hezbollah, the Lebanese Shia militant and political organization that had helped create in the early 1980s during Israel's occupation of southern Lebanon, gave Tehran a powerful proxy force on Israel's northern border and in the heart of Arab politics. Hezbollah's astonishing military performance against the Israeli army in the 2006 war, the first Arab force to fight Israel to a standstill in decades, made it a symbol of resistance that resonated across the Arab world, not just among Shia. Saudi Arabia regarded Hezbollah as an Iranian arm extended into the Arab heartland, a destabilizing force that served Tehran's interests rather than Lebanon's. The competition for influence in Lebanese politics between Saudi-aligned Sunni factions and the Iran-backed Shia Hezbollah became a microcosm of the broader rivalry. In Bahrain, the smallest of the Gulf monarchies and a country with a Shia majority ruled by a Sunni royal family, the Saudi-Iranian rivalry took on a particularly intimate character. Bahraini Shia communities had long complained of discrimination and political marginalization. When the Arab Spring reached Bahrain in February 2011 and large-scale protests broke out centered at Pearl Roundabout in Manama, Saudi Arabia acted with startling decisiveness. Within weeks, Saudi military forces crossed the causeway that connects Bahrain to the Saudi mainland and helped the Bahraini government crush the protests. The Saudis framed this intervention as resistance to an Iranian-backed destabilization campaign. Iran framed it as the suppression of a legitimate Shia uprising. In reality, it was both things simultaneously: a genuine popular protest that Tehran was happy to exploit, and a Saudi government willing to use military force to prevent any democratic or Shia breakthrough near its borders. Syria became the largest and most catastrophic proxy battlefield of all. When protests against President Bashar al-Assad broke out in March 2011 and were met with brutal military repression, Syria's civil war quickly drew in outside powers on all sides. Assad's government was supported by Iran, which had maintained a strategic alliance with Damascus since the early 1980s because Syria provided the land corridor through which weapons and supplies flowed to Hezbollah in Lebanon. Russia joined the pro-Assad coalition in 2015. On the other side, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Turkey, and the United States backed various Sunni opposition factions, including some that evolved into or intersected with jihadist groups. The Syrian civil war, which killed well over 300,000 people and displaced more than half the country's population, became an arena in which Saudi Arabia and Iran fought each other through layers of proxies in what was effectively a full-scale war conducted at arm's length. Yemen was the fourth and perhaps most devastating front. In 2014 and 2015, the Houthi movement, the Zaidi Shia rebel group from northwestern Yemen that Iran had cultivated with money, weapons, and training, swept out of its northern strongholds and captured the capital Sana'a, forcing the internationally recognized government of President Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi to flee. For Saudi Arabia, this was intolerable. The prospect of an Iran-aligned armed movement on its southern border, in a country that shared hundreds of miles of frontier with the kingdom, was the worst-case scenario. In March 2015, Saudi Arabia launched a massive military intervention in Yemen, leading a coalition of Arab states and backed with American intelligence and weapons. The Yemen war quickly became one of the world's worst humanitarian catastrophes, with tens of thousands of civilians killed by airstrikes and a blockade that exacerbated a famine affecting millions. The Houthis, for their part, launched missile and drone attacks deep into Saudi territory, striking oil infrastructure, airports, and cities. In September 2019, an attack, which the United States attributed to Iran and Iran denied, struck the Abqaiq oil processing facility and the Khouries oil field in Saudi Arabia, temporarily knocking out roughly half of the kingdom's oil production. It was the most dramatic escalation of the covert dimension of the Saudi-Iranian war in years, and it demonstrated that Iran was prepared to strike directly at the heart of Saudi economic power. What is striking about this era of the rivalry is how comprehensively it mapped onto the fault lines of Middle Eastern society. Saudi Arabia and Iran did not create the Sunni-Shia divide, the weak states, or the tribal and ethnic tensions that made these proxy wars possible. But they did exploit them systematically, filling the vacuums left by collapsing states with their money, their weapons, their ideologies, and their affiliated militias. In doing so, they helped transform local conflicts into regional ones and sectarian identities into political and military battle lines. By the mid-2010s, the Middle East resembled not so much a set of sovereign states as a patchwork of contested territories, armed factions, refugee flows, and humanitarian disasters, with Riyadh and Tehran pulling strings and deploying resources on opposite sides of virtually every significant conflict. The scale of destruction was staggering. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions displaced, ancient cities reduced to rubble. And at the center of it all, the two-way competition between the Saudi kingdom and the Iranian Republic. A competition driven not by the destiny of Islam alone, but by the very human drives of power, security, and survival. The third decade of the 21st century arrived with the Saudi-Iranian rivalry as deep and as dangerous as ever, but with several new elements in play that made the future harder to predict and the stakes higher than they had ever been. A new generation of leadership on both sides was redefining the conflict. A nuclear dimension had become impossible to ignore. And for the first time in decades, tentative signals of diplomacy suggested that the two countries might be capable, under the right circumstances, of pulling back from the brink. In Saudi Arabia, the rise of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, known internationally by his initials MBS, represented a generational and temperamental shift in how the kingdom approached its rivalry with Iran. The son of King Salman, MBS consolidated power with remarkable speed after his father's accession in 2015 and was formally named Crown Prince in 2017. He was young, ambitious, and impatient with what he regarded as his predecessor's excessive caution. He launched the Yemen military intervention. He orchestrated the blockade of Qatar in 2017, in part because Qatar maintained relationships with Iran that Saudi Arabia found unacceptable. He oversaw the detention of dozens of Saudi princes and businessmen in a sweeping anti-corruption campaign that doubled as a political consolidation. And he unveiled Vision 2030, an ambitious economic diversification plan designed to wean Saudi Arabia off its dependence on oil revenues, understanding that in a future of renewable energy, the kingdom's dominance rested on borrowed time. MBS's approach to Iran was simultaneously more aggressive in rhetoric and more desperate in its underlying logic. He understood that Saudi Arabia's traditional tool of influence, oil wealth deployed to build religious institutions and maintain political clients, was becoming less effective in a world where Iran had built durable, deeply rooted military and political organizations. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Popular Mobilization Forces in Iraq, the Houthis in Yemen, and various Syrian militias were not merely paid clients. They were ideologically committed movements with genuine popular bases. Saudi-backed Sunni factions, by contrast, often proved brittle and fractured. MBS needed a different approach, but he had not yet found one. In Iran, the Islamic Republic was navigating its own internal tensions. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, who had held the position since Khomeini's death in 1989, was aging. The Revolutionary Guards, the ideologically committed military force that was the instrument of Iran's regional influence operations, had become a state within the state with enormous economic and political power. The elected presidency oscillated between reformists who wanted to ease international isolation and hardliners who wanted to deepen resistance. The Iranian economy, battered by decades of sanctions and mismanagement, was producing chronic unemployment and inflation, fueling popular discontent that erupted periodically in protests in 2009, 2017, 2019, and 2022. The authorities suppressed each uprising, but the underlying grievances remained. The nuclear question loomed over everything. Iran's nuclear program had been a source of international concern since the early 2000s, when it became clear that Tehran was developing uranium enrichment capabilities that could, if advanced far enough, produce the fissile material for a nuclear weapon. Iran maintained that its program was entirely civilian, that it sought only nuclear energy and medical isotopes. The United States, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and most of the international community were skeptical. Years of negotiations culminated in the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, in which Iran agreed to limit its enrichment activities and submit to intrusive international inspections in exchange for relief from economic sanctions. For Saudi Arabia, the nuclear deal was profoundly troubling, even though it placed limits on Iran's nuclear program. The Saudis worried that the lifting of sanctions would flood Iran with revenues it would use to fund its regional proxy network. They worried that the deal legitimized Iran's right to enrich uranium at all. And they worried that American enthusiasm for the deal signaled a broader American shift toward accommodation with Iran and away from the traditional partnership with the Gulf monarchies. When President Donald Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sweeping sanctions on Iran, Saudi Arabia was broadly supportive. But the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign did not produce the Iranian capitulation its architects had predicted. Iran accelerated its nuclear program, enriching uranium to higher levels than the deal had permitted, and began threatening to approach the threshold of weapons-grade enrichment. By the early 2020s, Iran was assessed to be only weeks away from having enough enriched uranium for a nuclear device, though building an actual deliverable weapon would require additional time and steps. The prospect of a nuclear-armed Iran was not merely an abstract concern for Saudi Arabia. It would fundamentally change the regional power balance, potentially triggering a nuclear cascade as other regional states, including Saudi Arabia itself, sought to develop their own deterrent capabilities. MBS had explicitly said that if Iran acquired a nuclear weapon, Saudi Arabia would seek to develop one too. Against this backdrop, the announcement in March 2023 that Saudi Arabia and Iran had agreed to restore diplomatic relations, brokered by China in talks held in Beijing, was a genuine surprise to the world. The two countries had severed diplomatic ties in 2016, after Saudi Arabia's execution of a prominent Shia cleric named Sheikh Nim or Al-Nimr prompted protesters to attack Saudi diplomatic missions in Iran. The sudden restoration of relations, after years of pure hostility, suggested several things simultaneously. It suggested that both sides were exhausted by the costs of their proxy conflicts. It suggested that Saudi Arabia had recognized that the Yemen war, far from subduing Iranian influence, had become a costly quagmire with no clear exit. And it suggested that China had successfully positioned itself as a diplomatic power in the Middle East in a way that the United States had failed to do. The 2023 agreement did not resolve the underlying causes of the rivalry. It did not address the nuclear question. It did not end the Yemen war, though it contributed to a fragile ceasefire. It did not change the fundamental incompatibility between a revolutionary Islamic republic that challenges the legitimacy of monarchies and a monarchical kingdom that depends on the existing regional order for its survival. What it did was create a channel for communication and a temporary reduction in overt hostility, a sign that even bitter rivals sometimes recognize that the cost of unrestrained conflict can exceed the benefits. Whether this diplomatic opening would prove durable depended on forces that were not entirely in either country's control. The Palestinian-Israeli conflict, which exploded in October 2023 with Hamas's attack on Israel and Israel's devastating military response in Gaza, threatened to realign regional politics in ways that complicated both the Saudi-Iranian détente and Saudi Arabia's potential normalization of relations with Israel that had been under discussion in Washington. Iran backed Hamas and positioned itself as the defender of Palestinian rights. Saudi Arabia faced domestic and regional pressure that made it harder to maintain the pretense of business as usual. The future of the Saudi-Iranian rivalry will be shaped by forces already in motion: the energy transition and its impact on both oil-dependent economies, the demographic youth bulge in both countries, with populations hungry for economic opportunity and political voice, the succession question in Iran after Khamenei, and the question of whether Saudi Arabia, under MBS's eventual kingship, will find a sustainable path that doesn't require permanent confrontation with Tehran. What seems clear is that this rivalry will not end with a peace treaty. The roots are too deep, the identities too entangled, the historical wounds too fresh. What is possible is a managed competition, rivals who keep their conflicts at the level of proxy and politics rather than direct military confrontation, who maintain back channels even while they compete, who recognize that a war between them would be catastrophic for both. 14 centuries of history separate the Arabian Peninsula from the Persian Plateau. 14 centuries of faith, schism, empire, revolution, and blood. The rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not a misunderstanding that could be resolved by better communication. It is the expression of genuine differences in theology, in political culture, in historical memory, in national interest that will not dissolve easily or soon. But it is also a rivalry between human beings and human institutions, and human beings are capable, occasionally, of making choices that interrupt cycles of violence. Whether the leaders in Riyadh and Tehran, and the generations that will follow them, will find the wisdom and the courage to make those choices is the great unresolved question hanging over the Middle East. The world is watching, and history is waiting.